Good morning, church. You know the fellow that wrote that song was a good Southern boy, don't you? Yonder. I like that. We're so glad that you're here this morning. We have visitors. We're thankful that you're with us this morning. We have several that are out that are sick and just some that are visiting, and we want to remember them in our prayers for their safety and that they'll get well. Jay notified all of us early that he was sick. I don't look at my phone on Sundays till I get ready to come to church. And so it was about 8:15 when I looked at my watch or my phone and noticed that I had a text from Jay that said he was sick. Now let me assure you that his sickness, he says, is stomach. I think it has something to do with an 82-71 score yesterday where we found out who the real UT is. And being a Texas boy, I understand he has to root for them. But, sometimes you need to choose better. Well, we hope that he gets better soon. And next time I'll try to look at my phone a little earlier. And also I'm going to learn to play with a handout. I had not done that before. And I went in there and I looked at the instructions and that he had given me a long time ago. And it's like, nah. Not this morning, not in 5 minutes. But anyway, we'll do better next time. But we're glad that you're here. Hope that you'll stay. We're having Fellowship Sunday. Hope that you'll stay to eat with us. And following that, we will have a shortened service, probably just where we're sitting in the fellowship room. And so we hope that you'll stay for that. Do remember that on April 30th is the fifth Sunday as well. We're having Friends and Family Day. Start inviting people. There are some invitations. That's the word. They're out in the lobby, and be bringing your names and addresses of individuals that you'd like for the church to send an invitation to. We'd like to send one to a lot of folks, and so just be doing that in the next week or so. We would greatly appreciate that. There was a little boy one time. As a matter of fact, he was on rec team. It was not a very good team. It was probably average to below average team-wise. They were down by 4 runs to the opposing team, and the opposing team was the best team at that age bracket in that league. Last at bat. They had scored 4 runs. They had tied the ball. Well, they had scored 3 runs, and they had almost tied the ball game. They were down by 1. Bases were loaded. And the best pitcher in the league was brought in by the other team. He could pitch to one batter. And the batter that was up for this team was the worst batter in the league. He had not hit a ball. He had not even swung at a ball. And there was good old James that was in the dugout. Oh, we got this. We're going to win. Rooting that little fella on, knowing that if you watched him, his little knees were shaking so hard that he wasn't going to hit anything but one knee upon another. And sure enough, he struck out. James the whole time rooting him on, saying, we're going to win, we're going to win. And when he struck out, that third strike was called by the umpire. He said, well, maybe next time. You love those little children that have, if you will, just a little different spirit, a little different take on things in life, because reality, they knew that he wasn't going to hit that ball. You like those folks that have a different spirit about them. In the book of Numbers, there's the story of Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb were 2 of the 12 spies that were sent in Numbers 13 to spy out the land of Canaan. A representative from each of the 12 tribes was selected. Joshua and Caleb were selected as well. And they went to spy out the land. Now, here was their charge. Remember now, let's maybe even backtrack a little bit further than that. Go back a little bit with me to the fact that the children of Israel had been in Egyptian bondage for some 430 years. Moses had secured, if you will, through the hand of God, the power of God, Moses had secured their release, and so they have gotten out. They're now at the edge of the land which God had promised to them. They're right there able, if you will, to even see over it. They're able to see the land that God has said, this can be yours. And yet, we need to know about it. And so, these 12 spies are sent into the land of Canaan. Here's their charge. Their charge is, first of all, go look at the land and see what kind of land it is. Go look at the people and see how strong they are. Go look at the cities and to see if they're fortified. And you've got 40 days to do all of this. And so they go. And one of the first things they see and they realize is they're to go and spy out not just one little town. They're to actually go, and the part of their commission was to really to hit all the areas, all the quadrants, if you will, of the land. They find that many of them are kin and descendants of Anak, which were said to be giants. And archaeologists have helped us out to the fact that we know that the Anakims were larger, taller people than even we today are. So they were telling the truth when they came back. They came back and they said, 10 of them said, we can't take this land. We can't take this land. You see, we are grasshoppers in the land of giants. These folks are huge. They're tall. They're big. They're mighty. They're strong. And they brought for evidence, they brought clusters of grapes and figs that they had actually put on poles, if you will, and carried them in between two individuals. Now imagine we pick a cluster of grapes and we can hold it in a hand, maybe in two hands, but theirs were so big because it was a land that God had promised was flowed with milk and honey. It was a prosperous land. It was a good land. And so 10 of these spies came back and said, we can't do this. We can't overtake these people. We're grasshoppers in the land of giants. These folks are huge. Their cities are fortified. The land is rich. There's nothing we can do. They're bigger than us. They'll whip us. They're stronger than us. They're smarter than us. They're mightier than us. We can't do it. And little old Caleb speaks up and says, wait a minute. We can. Let's go take the land. With God's help, we can take the land. And yet you continue reading there in Numbers 13, and now you're into Numbers 14. The 10 spies make the heart of the people melt. Nope. We can't do this. And so then the people grow angry, and they grow angry at God. And they grow angry at God because why in the world didn't you just let us die? Why didn't you let us die while we were in Egyptian bondage? Why didn't you let us die from the standpoint of leading us out here? And basically you've led us out here to a point in which we're going to die anyway. God had heard that before. Remember when they crossed over the Red Sea, they'd said the same thing. But God had provided. God had pushed back the walls of the sea. They walked through not just on land, they walked through on dry land. They should have known. They should have believed. They didn't. But in Numbers, the 14th chapter, as God says, I've had enough. I'm sick of these people. I'm tired of these people. I'm tired of listening to them. All they're doing is complaining. All they're doing. And Moses says, God, no, wait a minute. Let's think about this. Let's think about these people. Let's think about what you've done. And let's think about, if you will, what the outside forces are going to say. The outside people are going to say, yeah, you led your children out here and you led them out here to slaughter. And God says, okay. Tell you what. Everybody is younger than 20 years of age. They can enter into the promised land. But those that are 20 and above, they will perish before they get into the promised land, save for Joshua and Caleb. In Numbers 14th chapter, verse 24, it says of Caleb that he had another spirit or a different spirit about him. That's God said that he's going to save him because he had a different spirit. So we have to ask ourselves, what was it about Caleb that was that different spirit? What was it about him that was different than all the other spies? What was it about Joshua and Caleb that was different? What was it about most specifically about Caleb that was so different that God would say he has a different spirit? Well, there probably are many things, but we're going to look at a few. One of them is that Caleb had faith. If you notice, and if you follow in that reading in Numbers 13 and then in Numbers 14, you find out that first of all, Caleb says that with God's help, we can overtake this land. And then as the people keep, or as the spies keep melting the hearts of the people, Caleb then speaks up and says, God, this is the battle of God. God's for us. God's for us. Let's take the land that God's going to give to us. He had faith in God. He trusted God. That God's going to get them to the place, God's going to get them to the land, and not only is God going to get them to the land, but that land is going to become theirs. They're going to take that land. And they're going to live in that land. Why? Because that's the land that God had promised them. Faith. Faith is essential, isn't it? Faith is really what brings us to God and what causes us to stay with God. We have faith. Now, we have faith in a lot of things. Faith is a trust. Faith in many ways is a conviction. From a standpoint of the Greek word, we define it as a trust and a conviction. But conjoined or put together, if you will, with action. But we trust many things. We trust the drivers that when we drive down the road, that they will obey the laws of the land. They won't run over us. We trust those that, as we're driving down the road, those that put the bridges in place, that they are safe and they're secure, that the inspectors have inspected them and that they are legitimate in their inspections. And we trust those individuals. We trust people all the time. We trust everything. But faith in God is essential. For without faith, it is impossible to please God. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. We know that well. But in order to have a different spirit, if you will, a spirit that is different from the world, we have to have a faith in God, a trust in God. In you, O Lord, do I put my trust, the psalmist said in Psalm 31 and verse 1. But let's ask the question. Let's ask the question of David. David, why did you trust in God? Caleb, why in the world did you trust in God? Go back to the faith chapter of Hebrews 11. Noah, why in the world did you trust in God? Abraham, why in the world did you trust in God? Enoch, why in the world did you trust in God? On and on. We could go down that list. Why did you trust in God? Because they realized God is. But beyond that, they believed that God was the one that could deliver them, that God was the one that would watch over them, that God was the one that would protect them, that God was the one that would be there for them. They believed in God and His power and His might. And in believing in God and His power and His might, they had that full conviction, that full trust, and they were willing to act upon what God had told them to do. That's faith. It's faith. God has told us to believe Him, to believe that He can supply all of our needs, Philippians chapter 4, verse 19. And so we have faith in God, but we also have faith through God, and we have faith because of God, but we have faith that God is God and will be our God. And so we trust Him. We trust Him in everything. We trust Him for everything. And we trust Him with everything. Isn't that what verse you're probably so familiar with that you probably know quite well? Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Lean not upon your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge Him, and He, talking about God, will bring it to pass. You see, when God says it, we should believe it. We should trust it. We should rely upon it. We should know that, as Caleb knew, this was a battle of God. In 2 Kings chapter 20, Jehoshaphat is leading the children of Israel, and Jehoshaphat knows that the impending armies that are coming against him are mightier than he and mightier than his army, and that there's no way that he can overtake the enemy that Israel is facing. And yet, God sent a messenger to Jehoshaphat to remind him of one simple thing. 2 Kings chapter 20 and verse 15. The battle belongs to God. In our life, the battle belongs to God. We must trust him. We must not be like the little children. There was two little children, and it was storming outside, and they were asleep, but the storm awakened them, and they began to cry. And the father, as he was running through the house, said, "It's all right. It's all right. We Joneses, we are people that are strong, and we believe in God." And when he finally got to the bedroom, they said, "Yes, we are Joneses, and yes, we're strong, but we want a God with skin on it when there's a storm in our life. We want that different spirit, whether it's storms or whether it's smooth sailing. To have that different spirit, we need to trust in God and to have faith in him." But then a second thing about Caleb is that not only did he have faith, but there's faithfulness. There's a difference. Or you might say, well, what's the difference? If you have faith in God, you'll have faithfulness. Not necessarily. A few years ago now, funeral director where I was at the time, also an acquaintance of mine, friend of mine, he calls me up and he says, "Paul, what are you doing Saturday about 2 o'clock?" I said, "Well, nothing." He said, "Would you like to do a funeral?" I said, "I never like to do a funeral, but I'll be glad to do a funeral." He said, "Well, I got a family here that doesn't have any connections to church of anybody in anywhere, and I'm going to be out of town, and they need somebody, and I figure, you can do this." And I said, "Okay, be glad to." And so I went. Didn't know the family, never had met the family. I talked to the daughter. The man was not married, but he had a daughter, grown. She had children. Anyway, I said, "I'd like to talk to you before services, kind of get a sense of, him, so I can say a few things about him." And she said, "Oh, sure." And she talked to me. And here's one of the things that she said that resonated in my ears and in my heart for a long time. She said, "My daddy had faith, but my daddy never did do anything about it." I said, "Excuse me, what?" She said, "Oh, my dad believed God. But," she said, "I never once saw him hold the Bible. I never once saw him in prayer. I never once went with him to church because I never went." So he believed God. That was the extent of it. There's more to faith, if you will, than just faith. There's a faithfulness. Now, when you think about Caleb and you think about when he was born, Caleb was actually, if you trace it out, Caleb was actually born while the children of Israel were in Egyptian bondage. So Caleb was born a slave. Now he's free man. And yet in all of this, in Numbers 14 and also in Joshua 15, we find out one central aspect, that in all of his years, Caleb was faithful to God. He didn't just have a faith in God, he was faithful to God. He trusted in God, and trusted in God, was willing then to give his life to God and hang everything within his life on God. And wherever God was willing to lead him and wherever God did lead him, he was willing to go. There was a faithfulness to the call, and so he was dedicated to the call of God. Faithfulness for us means that there are times when we have to stand for the word of God. Faithfulness for us means times that we need to be, as Paul would say in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. The old King James says, "Study. Show yourself approved of God." The New King James, more correctly, I think, translates the word, says, "Be diligent. Show yourself approved in God, a workman needs not to be ashamed, rightly dividing or handling right the word of God." Be diligent in all things to show yourself approved to God. Diligent. What's diligent? Diligent is the idea of put every effort into it to do what? To be found pleasing to God. Put all your efforts into it to be pleasing to God. Faithfulness says, I'm going to put all my efforts into it to be pleasing to God. That's faithfulness. God, what do you want me to do? That our conversation or our conduct, Philippians chapter 1, verse 27, let your conduct be as becomes the gospel of Christ. Whether I come see you or else hear of your affairs, Paul says, that I may know that you stand fast, God. Paul says, I want to know where you're standing. I want to know how you're living your life. And are you living your life faithful to God? Caleb had another spirit about him, and part of that was the fact that he was faithful, and he was faithful to God, faithful to his word, and faithful to his instructions, faithful in the fact that he was willing to follow the Lord. That's the faithfulness that we need. But then thirdly, Caleb had this other spirit about him, another spirit or a different spirit. It was a spirit of fortitude. Now you think about this. You come back, you have been 40 days, you have gone throughout this land of Canaan. You have seen the same things that the other 10 spies have seen. You have seen the cluster of grapes. You have seen the figs. You have seen the lush promised land. You have seen these huge individuals. You have seen how well fortified the cities are. And you've watched as 10 other guys have literally just told people. They brought back evidence and they have told them what they saw and what they experienced. And they are convincing people. And with each passing day, with each passing hour of their testimony and of their evidence of saying, this is what we saw, this is what we heard, people are beginning to say, yeah, I believe them. We can't do this. Beyond us. And you're the lone voice. You and your friend Joshua are the lone voices in standing up and saying, we're going to do it. We're going to do it with God's help. Can you imagine being that one or two voices in the midst of many that cry out and say, this is the way it's going to be done. God's for us. God's with us. God's going to take care of us. We're going to take it. Not a problem. Fortitude. Courage. The courage of conviction to say, we're going to be able to. That God's going to help us. That God's going to give us the victory, that courage. If we're going to have that other spirit about us like Caleb had, we've got to have that same conviction, that same courage of conviction. That courage of conviction that's willing to stand. While Peter would remind us that we're to be ready to always give an answer. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. Let the word of Christ be that which we stand for. To be that which believes and truly trusts and know that God is God. And not only is God God, but we're willing to stand for him and tell folks the truth. Galatians chapter 2. Paul comes to one of the most influential early leaders in the church. Paul comes to a man by the name of Peter. You've heard of him, one of the apostles. And we read in the book of Acts, we see, we don't get very far, we get in Acts 2, and we see Peter taking the lead. And we see Peter, Acts 3, Acts 4, Acts 5, Acts 6, Acts 7, Acts 8, Acts 9, Acts 10, Acts 11. We see Peter, and it's in Acts 12 that all of a sudden Paul begins to become more of an influence in the early church. And really, it's not that Peter decreased. It's just a matter that we begin to see in Luke, if you will, in his recording of the history there of the church, begins to follow the actions of Paul. Peter's still active in the church. In Galatians chapter 2, though, Paul comes to this early leader, this man that as he grows older, we know in 1 Peter chapter 5 is an elder in the church. And Paul said that he withstood him to the face. Why did Paul, how was he so bold, and why was he so bold, and how did he think that he could withstand Peter? Because here's what Paul said. He said, I withstood him to the face because when certain men from James came to him, he said he had been receiving Gentiles, but when certain men from James came to him, he said he didn't receive them anymore. In other words, I'm going to straighten him out. I'm going to talk to him. Now, we have no way of knowing how the conversation went, other than it went the way the text says, and that's basically there was an agreement that Paul would go to the Gentiles from that point on. But Paul was willing to withstand him to the faith. Paul was willing to have the courage. You know, I thought about that this week, and I thought about a lot of the men that I had as teachers and undergraduate, and sadly, a good portion of them have passed away. But I thought, you know, I only spoke up one time in undergraduate, spoke up 2 or 3 times in graduate school. But I just wasn't sure of everything. And I believed them and I listened to them, and I wonder if that's not how Paul felt towards Peter, but he was willing to stand him because he knew that he needed to correct what was wrong in his life. Think about the courage of Daniel to pray, even though even though they had told him that if he prayed to God, that he'd be thrown to a lion's den. Think about the fact that in Daniel 6, verse 10, that it says that he went up and opened up his windows towards Jerusalem and knelt on his knees and prayed as was his custom. Now, it's interesting that Darius tells Daniel to keep on serving the God that he served and he'll protect you. It's kind of interesting how the other folks saw who Daniel was following, but the courage to do what needed to be done and what was supposed to be done, even when the kingdom was not. Or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego thrown into the fiery furnace. The courage to stand up to a king. Fortitude that it takes. We might call it the backbone, the courage. The fact that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, sound mind. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 12. God has told us, be strong. Be of good courage. Be not afraid. It's interesting. Because you know that fellow we've been mentioning with Caleb, Joshua? In Joshua chapter 1, that was part of Joshua's commission, wasn't it? We studied it on Wednesday night in auditorium class. That was part of the commission of Joshua. Be strong, be of good courage. Don't be afraid. That fortitude, that courage, that's willing to stand. In 1992, in Columbine, you've probably heard the story of how a couple of young people went into that high school and shot up the school, killed 15, injured many more, had ammunition, smoke bombs, and all kinds of other paraphernalia. The story that came out of it, or one of the many stories that came out of it, was that one of the gunmen walked up to Cassie Burnell and said, "Do you believe in God?" And she said, "Yes, I do." And he shot her right there, point blank, killed her. The courage of that young girl to admit right there, knowing, because that was something that was being hollered out by these 2 young boys as they were going through the school shooting, knowing that it would probably cost her life. The courage of conviction. That's the courage we need in a society today that has gone away from the church, away from the teachings of the Bible. You don't have to read far on the internet if you read religious circles to find out that fewer and fewer people in the United States of America are going to church. And fewer people are even reading the Bible. Still the bestseller, but we don't know how many people are really reading it. And what we do find in surveys that are conducted is fewer and fewer people are reading it. And so consequently, we have a society where morals and ethics, if you will, are formed and contained not by God's word, but by philosophies and thoughts of folks that are amoral. They have morals. Their morals are their own, but they're not the morals of God. We've come to a time in our society where it's time to speak up. Not be belligerent, not be ugly, not be individuals that are trying to just put people in their place, but just speak up and say, this is what we believe. And this is why we believe it. That was the spirit that Caleb had, a spirit of fortitude. But also, Caleb also had a spirit of forbearance. What is forbearance? What's the idea of patience? Poor old Caleb. I'm thankful for the fact that he got to go into the promised land, because he did show his faith. He did show his faithfulness. He did show his courage. But only he and Joshua, that had come out of the land, if you will, that were adults, come out of Egyptian bondage, were able to go in. They were saved by the grace of God. But just think, here he is again, able to see into the promised land, and it's 40 more years before he gets in. He's 85 by the time he gets to set foot into the promised land. He was patient. We grow impatient at times, don't we? The preacher just keeps preaching, and there's food in the back, and we can smell it, and he keeps talking and talking, and when is he going to shut up? Well, sometime today. Be still. Psalm 46 and verse 10. And know that I am God. Yeah, God, who's our refuge and strength, very present help in time of trouble. In that same psalm says, be still, be patient, and know that I am God. So there has to be a patience. There has to be a patience that Caleb had with God, but there also has to be a patience that Caleb had with everybody else. Now, I don't know, because the text doesn't tell us what kind of conversations Caleb had with the other 10 spies. Why didn't you tell them the truth? Why didn't you tell them God's going to help us? Why? I don't know if he got in their face or not. It doesn't tell us. But I see a man of forbearance, a man that understood that you need to be patient with others as well. If we will see God as he is, Romans chapter 8, verse 31, God before us, who can be against us? A God that's on our side. A God that has promised to help us. A God that has given us the hope that we need. A hope that is, as Paul would write in Romans chapter 8, for we're saved by hope, but hope that is seen is not yet hope. So Paul says, God has given us hope. A God that tells us in that same passage there in Romans chapter 8 that we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. That we gain the victory, that victory is ours, that just as Caleb had said, hey, with God's help and God's on our side, we can do this. We have the same assurance. And so we stand proud, we stand with God, but we stand in patience, knowing that everyone won't listen and everyone won't heed and everyone won't do as we would have them to do. While we pray for them and we keep talking to them with love and compassion, we must be still. Be patient. And so to have that other spirit, we need that spirit of forbearance. But then Caleb also had a spirit that is interesting. It was a spirit of what we're going to call optimism. You see, he looked at it and he said, man, we can do this. This is not a problem. The 10 said, no, we can't do this. They saw the obstacles. Caleb saw what was going to get them over the obstacles. They saw the pitfalls. They saw the problems. Caleb realized there's no pitfalls. There's no problems. God's going to get us through. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be difficulties. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be hard times. That doesn't mean that the future is always going to be bright and shiny. But it is to say that you look on it with an attitude and an atmosphere of understanding that with God's help, we can do it. Paul in Philippians chapter 4, verse 13 said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. David would remind us in 2 Samuel chapter 22, beginning in verse 2. It's also the same psalm, if you will, is found in 2 Samuel, or Psalm 18, excuse me. But in it, David proclaims, the Lord's my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my high tower, in him will I trust. It's the horn of my salvation. You see, we often look at life and we look at living the Christian life and we look at doing the things that God would have us to do, and we say we can't. We look at the pitfalls. We look at the problems, and we don't see the promises. We don't see the hope. We don't see the end. We're seeing the middle. Do you remember David and Goliath? David and Goliath. David went out and with sling and with really one stone killed the giant Goliath. A feat that none of his other countrymen or even his own brothers, his own kin wanted to do, wanted to face. But when he went out with his eyes towards God, he realized the giant was not too big to be scared of. He was too big to miss. Our God's the same way. He says, look, I'm going to get you through this. Just hang on. Hold tight. It's going to be all right. We're headed home. We're headed to heaven. And we need that optimism that says we can. With God's help, who is our rock, who is our fortress, who is our deliverer, we can overcome. And so, Caleb was able to enter into the promised land with a different spirit. Yeah, a spirit of faith and faithfulness, a forbearance and fortitude, and a spirit of optimism. Was able to face the foes and able to face the enemies and able to overcome and able to enter into that land that God had promised. We're on Wednesday night in the auditorium class, we're studying, we just began Joshua, the children of Israel going into that land. Don't you want to go to that land? Don't you want to go? I do. And I think you do too. But I think we have to have the spirit of Caleb. Do you have it? Are you a New Testament child of God? Are you an individual that needs to put your Lord and Savior on in baptism for the remission of your sins? Or you need to rededicate your life? Our prayer is that you'll come. All together we stand and sing.